Welcome to session 51 of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. The book that we're going to be talking about in this particular session is R. Scott Bakker's The Warrior Prophet. As you can tell, it's quite a tome, coming in at over 600 pages, including, the appendices that have maps and a few other things as well. So this is a real tome here, and it's part of a trilogy, the Prince of Nothing Trilogy, which is part of the Second Apocalypse series of 7 books. The Prince of Nothing Trilogy is the first part, then the next 4 books comprise the second part. Bakker is supposed to be working on a third part to it, but nobody's quite sure whether that's going to come off or not. The Prince of Nothing series can be read on its own, as it has been by many people, as self-contained, as a really amazing work of epic fantasy, incorporating a lot of insights from Bakker's own background in philosophy. A lot of people don't know that he actually almost finished a PhD in philosophy. He also studied literature, and he's got an academic background, but he also has a lot of interesting things to say about the literary world and why he chose fantasy, why he got into that and why we should be paying close attention to the fantasy work that's out there. So we're going to talk a bit about biography, much less than we did in the previous session devoted to the first book, the Darkness That Goes Before. We already covered a lot of the biography, so I don't think we need to do that again. We're going to talk a good bit about world building and what's revealed about Earwa, the narrative universe that this is set within. And we're going to talk a lot about some of the key philosophical themes, about some of the character development that's going on, despite some of the reviewers saying that no character development took place. And actually, I should mention, we're going to get into some discussion about reviews. Before we do that, though, I want to say, so this is part of a longer series, Worlds of Speculative Fiction, that has been going on since 2016, when we first moved back here to Milwaukee, and I partnered with the Brookfield Public Library to do a 1-year sequence on Worlds of Speculative Fiction, allowing me to do some guilty pleasure reading of classic, sci-fi, fantasy, horror authors that I was particularly interested in, looking at the philosophical themes and the narrative universes that these authors put out in their works. And it continued on. We're now in the 6th year. Obviously, COVID has forced us to change the format a bit. What we do is a video like this, usually me talking for about 90 minutes about the work, exploring some of the key ideas. It premieres on YouTube Live. People can interact with me directly as they're watching the video. And then it's followed by a non-recorded, more intimate Zoom session where we talk about the book, the themes, the key developments, and all sorts of other things as well. We're hoping eventually to get back to meeting in libraries and recording those sessions like we did with earlier ones, but we'll see what happens. So this is what we're doing for the time being. If you're interested in other authors, series, texts that we've covered, you want to click the Show More and go into the video description, and there's a link to the entire series. This is number 51, so you can guess that we've actually covered a lot of authors, some of them several times in this series. So that said, I want to begin by bringing up something that Bakker himself has one of his characters muse about in the works. And he says, "A book was never read," in quotes. "Here as elsewhere, language betrayed the true nature of the activity. To say that a book was read was to make the same mistake as the gambler who crowed about winning as though he'd take it by force. To toss the number sticks was to seize a moment of helplessness, nothing more. But to open a book was by far the more profound gamble. To open a book was not only to seize a moment of helplessness, not only to relinquish a jealous handful of heartbeats to the unpredictable mark of another man's quill. It was a lot to allow oneself to be written. For what was a book, if not a long consecutive surrender to the movements of another's soul? Isn't that an interesting way to put the act of reading? And it might make you think about what's going on as we read this book. It also harkens back to insights about reading coming from, for example, St. Augustine, who talks about us, thinking that we're reading the book when in reality the book is reading us. We often take books as if they're just, presentations of data or information, when really they are something like the soul of another encapsulated in words, giving us a perspective on something, allowing us to enter into their world to some degree, putting things forward that we might have resistance against at first and say, I don't believe that, and then slowly seducing us, bringing us into their perspective. There are other books where we might, read them. Great example of this is, he begins with a quote in this book from Immanuel Kant, right? He says, this is from the Foundation of the Metaphysics of Morals, a book that I've taught many times. Here we see philosophy brought to what is, in fact, a precarious position, which should be made fast even though it is supported by nothing in either heaven and earth. Here philosophy must show its purity as the absolute sustainer of its laws and not as a herald of laws which implanted sense or who knows what tutelary nature whispers to it. And we can talk about why quote Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals and why talk about philosophy in a book of literature, which doesn't have any philosophers alive in it at the time. There are references to philosophers. And part of the answer would be what Kant is actually after in that, the book itself seems to be just about morality, but it's really about freedom and the capacity to give oneself laws, structure, orientation, which a lot of people think they're doing in this text and in the entire series, but actually aren't. They are, just their thoughts and feelings are coming out of the darkness that goes before, right? So, that's kind of an interesting thing to start with. I also wanted to bring up another thing that Bakker said in a Reddit AMA. And I think this is more something to be suggestive rather than to try to explain right now, but I'll read it to you. He says, if God is dead, then fantasy is his grave. I've spent 35 years now searching for the secret of meaning, chasing research across disciplines and arguments through millennia. What is it? Why does it seem to be slowly boiling away? My short fiction and nonfiction on the subject have been published in Nature, Midwest Studies, and Philosophy, and the Journal of Consciousness Studies. But epic fantasy has always been my primary vehicle. Notice, I'm going to break my rule there. Notice what he says there, vehicle. Not just like, oh, it's my passion, oh, I'm just trying to tell a good story. It is a vehicle. He says, for me, fantasy fiction is the crash site of meaning. Create a world possessing the structure of biblical Israel or Vedic India or Homeric Greek, and it will be called fantastic. Create an alternate intrinsically meaningful world, and the world will instantly recognize that it is especially false. The very shape of meaning now indicates delusion, and this, I think, should give us pause. So I guess you could say that for me, fantasy is a pretty serious thing, something worth pissing people off about. My nutty ambition was to write the only kind of Bible a human could write in this remarkable and blasphemous age, a far different book of Revelation, more honest to the complicated edges of the world, equally horrific a textual crypt for the corpse of God. And so a lot of rich ideas there in that quotation, I would say. And so, well worth mulling over. Let's jump now into looking at some of the things that Bakker said about the writing of this particular work. And I think that we can draw them in large part from this great interview with Bakker in SFF World, the website by Dag R, carried out by Rob Bedford. Before that, I want to read a little bit from the foreword that gets brought up a lot, or the acknowledgments rather. He says, Since I had over 15 years to write The Darkness That Comes Before, I really had no idea what I was getting into when I committed to finishing The Warrior Prophet within 1 year. I thought a year was a long time, but now after watching the seasons flicker past my window quicker than commercials, I know better. As a consequence of my miscalculation, I inadvertently complicated the lives of all those around me, both professionally and personally. Never have I been indebted to so many I would like to thank, and then he goes down this entire list of people who he has to thank as a result. And I think as an academic myself and somebody who does a lot of things, a year can go by incredibly fast, and so I think that's quite an interesting insight. Now, in this interview, he's asked, with Darkness, you didn't have a deadline, and most pressure was probably from yourself as your own editor. In completing The Warrior Prophet, was there a deadline and/or external pressure to complete the work? Did the critical success of Darkness have an impact to your approach in writing The Warrior Prophet? And so he goes on and he says, I can honestly say that the last year was the most trying year of my life, labor-wise. Why? I taught part-time at Fanshawe College here in London, Ontario, rewrote and defended the prospectus to my dissertation, and completed The Warrior Prophet. I woke up at 5 a.m. every morning, 7 days a week. Between May 2003 to March 2004, I took only 1 day off to get messy with my buddies and watch The Return of the King, which came out at the time. I wrote on Christmas. I even worked with a hangover on New Year's Day. And so, you can say, well, that doesn't sound too bad. I mean, you're by yourself. You get to work in the morning. Doesn't that sound wonderful? And I can tell you, as somebody who actually did write a prospectus, defended the prospectus, wrote a dissertation, there is an incredible amount of work involved in that. He was a graduate student still at Vanderbilt while he's doing all of that and doing it from a distance. Teaching part-time very often, especially at the very beginning of your teaching career, sounds like a nice, little excursion into things. It's a lot of work, and he's also trying to write this whole book at the same time. So, that's actually quite a monumental achievement. So he goes on in the interview and says, because I had about 15 years to finish The Darkness That Comes Before, I really had no idea what I was getting into when I signed the deals for The Warrior Prophet and The Thousandfold Thought. Suddenly, and here's a really interesting point of view, and this actually I think kind of fits into themes that show up in these books. My private passion had become a collective enterprise, and I don't just mean the immediate circle of commercial interests that suddenly spring up around an author, people like your agent, editor, publicist, greedy relatives, and so on. There's your readers as well. Buying into an uncompleted series, especially by an unknown author, is an act of faith. $26 is a tank of gas or a week's worth of groceries for me. The idea of defaulting on my end of the bargain tormented me, and the idea of writing anything other than the book I felt compelled to write was unthinkable. Pressure. So he wanted this book to measure up to what the previous book had provided to readers. And he says, add to this all the crazy reviews The Darkness That Comes Before was racking up. I really thought the book was a love it or hate it work, which was no problem as far as I was concerned, because I didn't write it for everybody. I thought the reviews would be split and that the raves, if I received any, would be peppered with telling criticisms. After all the reviews the book has received, I think the first review I read comes closest to my own feelings towards the book. Everyone else has been too kind, including you, Rob. This is where I think the pressure was a good thing, because my schedule was so tight, I really had no time to fret that much over whether The Warrior Prophet would live up to its predecessor. As the collective concerns faded into a single imperative, write your ass off. And as strange as it may sound, suddenly there was me, the world, the characters, and a blank screen, just like the good old days. And then he says, now that I have time, I'm freaking out. So, this is a product of, grinding away, getting things done, working with the characters, the world that he already had in place, but now getting it down on paper. I do want to bring up one other thing. He's asked, was The Warrior Prophet a more difficult work? And Bakker says, both books were difficult for different reasons. And And, talking about Warrior Prophet, he says, I already had the world in place, and in certain aspects this made things so much easier. Even still, I found the new difficulties that arose just as challenging. And so a little bit later he says, the main difficulties I faced in the Warrior Prophet stemmed directly from the outrageous goals I'd set myself, right? So he set himself up for this. In a sense, the book is about conquest, the myriad and often bizarre ways in which humans submit to one another, whether through violence or seduction. So on the one hand, there's the conquest of the heathen by the Holy War. I really wanted the Holy War to come across as a living, breathing thing, as an alternate protagonist. In fact, doing this, however, required a line of quasi-historical narration threaded through the various strands of character narration. Since I wanted to play these two lines against each other in interesting ways, they became painstaking affairs. So that's tough to do, right? Also, I find the tendency is to gloss over the details when telling the story of collective actions, to narrate at a level that invites abstractions. That's what makes history boring to many people. So there is this continuous struggle to keep the Holy War concrete, to keep it alive in my reader's imagination. If I think I succeeded, it's only because I recognize it's impossible to carry everyone with you. And then he says, on the other hand, there's the conquest of the Holy War from within by Kellhus. Here my goal was to tell a story that shows a prophet coming to power rather than simply telling it. Think about the difference between describing a conversation that captivates a listener and actually giving that conversation. The former need not be captivating at all, whereas the latter has to be somewhat if the reader is to find its consequences plausible. So that is some tough stuff to write. Now, if you think about it, he's placing himself in a long-standing literary context in which people have managed to pull these sorts of things off. This grand, epic, historical, semi-historical, really fantasy narrative that doesn't get dry or abstract because the characters themselves are absolutely central to it, without turning the characters into it's just a battle of superheroes against supervillains or anything like that on the one hand. And then to tell the story of how something is subverted from within progressively by the warrior prophet. How to tell a story that shows somebody who we as readers, and not all readers responded to this, but we as readers could say, yeah, I would buy into this guy and his movement. And if you think about who else has managed to pull that off in the sci-fi fantasy world, obviously Frank Herbert with Dune, right? And thinking about the development of the whole you could call it emperor sequence and supplantation of the old empire by Paul Atreides, the Muad'Dib, right? And I think we could come up with a lot of other examples as well. But that's difficult stuff to narrate. So I think that is some important insights about the development of this book. In lieu of biography, what we're talking about more is, we might call it the biography of a book and its author carried along. I want to talk about some of the reviews next because I think that they can be quite revealing. After having reread and really thoroughly re-enjoyed and saw so much more in this book than I did the first time around when I was kind of, getting through it to try to find out what was going to happen next, knowing the story ahead of time, I thought it would be good to see what other people had to say about the work, more or less from its own time. Since I first read this only a year and a half to 2 years ago, and then, reread it recently, there's not that sense of, okay, this is the new thing that's coming out. I wanted to see what people had to say. And there were, quite a few positive reviews, a lot of negative reviews out there on the internet, the blogosphere about it. And we'll talk about what people found negative in the work and some of the responses that we might have to that. But first, let's talk about some of the positive things. So Victoria Strauss, who has been a quite important reviewer and engager of Bakker, writes, all that careful preparation pays off in The Warrior Prophet, the preparation that was carried out in the first book, The Darkness That Came Before, in which, because the world and its inhabitants have already been so thoroughly established, very little digression is needed. At 600 pages, one couldn't exactly call this a lean novel, but it is a well-knit and muscular one with more straightforward plotline than its predecessor and a headlong narrative momentum that keeps the reader riveted to the page. In some way, it's less character-centered than the first volume, for where Darkness focused most intensely on the many viewpoint characters whose struggles and choices often eclipsed the larger drama stirring around them. In The Warrior Prophet, the larger drama dominates, particularly the progress of the Holy War, though it could be said that the Holy War is itself a character, complete with its own viewpoint, an omniscient God's eye perspective that encompasses the entire field of battle. Now, I think she's actually wrong about that, because if that was the case, we would also have the perspective of the Phanim, much more represented. Instead, it's really the Inithri and what's happening with them, and we do get some perspectives much more than others in this. Again, she goes on and says, underpinning everything is the meticulous world building. Earwa is a creation of enormous depth, unique in detail, fascinating in custom and history. No aspect has been neglected. It is, for instance, one of the few fantasy settings I've encountered in which there appears to be a real literature. This is a very interesting insight on her part, I think. Literature for literature's sake. That is, not mere window dressing or a way for the author to sneak in a few info dumps via an ancient document or two. Creating a world is not so difficult. Anyone with a little invention and time, a lot of time can do it. But to create a world so nuanced, so consistent, so fraught with the kind of moral ambiguity we daily encounter in our own non-fantasy lives is far more difficult. And again, I would say, in broad respects, I think she's right. One of the few fantasy settings in which there appears to be a real literature. If we include New Weird, I would say we probably do have a literature within that, right? Or even old weird tales or horror. Fantasy, that's a very broad thing, but I don't know if she's right about the exclusivity. She is definitely right about having created a world that already has long-standing disputes, modes of thought that aren't just political or epic in the sense of good versus evil, but really quite deep in that respect. So I think those are some good insights. James Schellenberg, in another review, says, I'm pleased Bakker has kept some of the brutally unheroic aspects of his historical model for the series, the real-life crusades. Some of the typical fantasy notions get in the way of this, notably Acamian's search for the ultimate evil, the consult, and all the related prophecies. On the other hand, this makes Acamian one of the few sympathetic characters in the book, as everyone else is soaked in blood for no reason other than personal aggrandizement, however thinly cloaked by religious rhetoric. I'd say that Schellenberg's actually wrong about that. We'll get to that in a moment. But he says, The Warrior Prophet is an exceptionally violent book, and rightfully so for its subject matter. About the only historically based atrocity not included so far would be the sack of a friendly city, for example, the attack on Byzantium, but these are definitely vicious killers. He goes on and he says, also worth noting is the way that Bakker keeps his magic strictly in the background. In terms of narrative strategy, Bakker accomplishes this by making practitioners rare. The various sorceress schools have few adherents, and military commanders tend not to tell their soldiers the fact that it's worth sacrificing thousands of them even to kill one sorcerer. Interestingly, the Mandate, often ignored or mocked, have some of the most powerful magic, and there's a blowout of a scene later in the book where we finally see Acamian defending himself. So some good insights there, I think, some good points of view. I would disagree that Acamian is one of the few sympathetic characters in the book. I would say that even Knier is a sympathetic character in many respects, at least for me. And that, interestingly, Bakker himself in another interview said that Canefas is one of the characters that he actually quite likes. Many of us, I think, find him detestable, but, I think he's wrong about that. I also think that the ultimate evil, the consult, doesn't actually make the book lesser in any way. But so there we get some, fairly positive characterizations of this book, contemporary to its coming out. There were a lot of complaints about the book in the online literature that I could see. And what did the complaints really center around? Well, the violence was an integral part of it. Why do the battle scenes have to be so bloody? There were some who deplored that. There were a lot of accusations that in this book, The Warrior Prophet, there is a serious lack of character development, and we'll talk about that. I think that's definitely worth taking up. There's also, complaints about there being too much marching, too much holy war. And, it's sort of like saying, I'm going to read a romance novel. There's too much kissing in it, and why do they have to be so much focused on romantic attachment? Why couldn't they have talked more about grain prices in Britain in 1838? So some of these are kind of silly complaints. One that's really quite interesting that we're going to get into, the idealization of Kelhus. The whole book centers around, and I think this is people getting seduced by the title, the whole book centers around the warrior prophet and his story. He's the only real character. This is a glorification of somebody. I mean, some went so far as to suggest that Bakker was basically engaging in wish fulfillment about his own, desires to control things and subvert from within. But like I said, we'll get to that in a moment. Another key issue that came up was, well, there are two issues when it comes to sexuality. One is that there are too few female characters and that they are all depicted as essentially whores or prostitutes who may in fact have power like the Empress does, but does so through the use of her sexuality, so that this is, an inherently, typically misogynistic and tone deaf to women's concerns kind of story. And, we'll get into that in a moment. The other one that I saw on a few websites was the sexuality. There's too much discussion of sex scenes, and a lot of it's just gross, They complained about necrophilia. They complained about the skin spies. They complained about, all of the sexuality that's involved with the consult in general, black semen. Isn't that terrible? And a lot of this, I think, came from people who are just kind of prudish, basically. But there is something to that. So let's look at some things. Again, in another interview carried out by Dag R with R. Scott Bakker in SFF World, he says, this is the question put to Bakker, the genre exhibits a strong, albeit recent tradition for subverting gender stereotypes by presenting worlds in which strong, independent female characters are plausible or even expected. Yet your world is as patriarchal as the reality that inspired it. I expect that this theme makes up for a good bit of the discussions you have about your creation, possibly detracting from what you actually want to talk about. Is it difficult to resist the temptation to put something like a badass tomboy warrior princess with snappy dialogue and a heart of gold into the books? So here's what Bakker says in response to that. First, let me say I think I should be called out onto the carpet on this issue simply because I cover some pretty troubling ground. I certainly don't believe in quota characterization either to be politically correct or to broaden the gender appeal of my books. Leave this for the after-school specials. I also don't think that depiction automatically equals endorsement. The question people should be asking, it seems to me, is whether I reinforce negative gender stereotypes or problematize them. If the books provide enough grist to argue this question, then the answer to me, it seems to me, automatically becomes the latter, that they're actually problematizing rather than just merely reinforcing. Then he says, but the fact remains a lot of people get hung up on my female characters. On the one hand, I self-consciously chose the harlot, the waif, and the harridan for my female characters. Yet some seem to think a kind of unconscious moral defect chose them for me. If so, it would be a truly colossal coincidence that I would happen to pick the 3 misogynistic types. I mean, isn't it obvious that I'm up to something critical? On the other hand, I wanted my fantasy world to be realistic, to temper our yearning for pre-modern times with a good look at how ugly things got, particularly in times of war. When bad things happen to my female characters, it's the circumstances that are being criticized, not the characters themselves. That's an interesting perspective as well, I would say. He says, but people get hunches while they read, and once they do, confirmation bias goes to work. And this is simply one among many reasons why we always buy our own bullshit, and the text, I think, possesses more than enough ambiguities for people to spin any number of self-validating interpretations. It's when they insist their interpretation is the only interpretation, or even worse, that it captures what's really going on in my being, that I become baffled. So he's saying, listen, I'm not going about, trying to create a fantasy world in which, all of these great female heroines suddenly replace all the male ones, or, are on a position of equality. I'm going to tell stories, but it's the way that I'm telling it that you need to pay close attention to, not just, what numbers I have or, what's going on. And I would argue, as I'm going to a little bit later, that Asimov undergoes some pretty significant development in this, even if the Empress and Cherryh perhaps don't. And that, the skin spies, despite the fact that they don't have a soul, and they're essentially a different gender altogether, there's something else interesting going on with them, particularly in relation to Knier. And Knier himself is a very interesting character in this respect. Super hyper masculine in some ways, and yet in other ways, kind of subverting that. Bakker also in the Reddit AMA said something about I think this applies essentially to the consult. He says, I sexualize evil in my world, which morally charges the stakes, I think, but I wanted to do this against an inhuman, awe-inspiring background. Ultimately, the point is to connect the horror within the book to the horror confronting all of us now, even though the vast majority remain blissfully unaware of it. And I think he's talking about nihilism there and all the things that come out of it, or are, catastrophe times in terms of meaning. But, the Inkeroi are, as they call themselves, a race of lovers, and sexuality is something that is at the heart of their way of approaching things, a very exploitative sexuality in many respects, one which is tied together with violence. And, is Bakker gross and horrible for exploring that? No, because is he endorsing it? I don't see that happening. In fact, he seems to be helping us to be aware about how seductive that could be within the Inkeroi, within the Srank, within the skin spies of the consult. So, a little bit later, I do want to come back to this other issue of Kalhus. In a couple interviews, he says some really interesting things about Kalhus, Asenabur Kalhus, the central main character among several main characters. And in an interview with Jessica Strider in Sci-Fi Fan Letter, she asked, what was the hardest scene for you to write? And he said, all the Kalhus scenes in The Prince of Nothing were exceedingly difficult. The scene at the end of The Darkness That Comes Before, where he lays the groundwork for his subsequent domination of the Holy War, that was a challenge as much because of my inexperience as for its complexity, I think. In another interview with Victoria Strauss, he says, in a formal sense, portraying Kalhus' superhuman intelligence was relatively easy. I would start with straight dialogue for Kalhus' scenes, which I would go over again and again, each time giving Kalhus more in way of insights and observations. It was the substance of these insights and observations that proved exceedingly difficult to write. But here again, I had the luxury of time. I would work and rework them until I eventually came up with something Kalhus-worthy. I took a shotgun approach. But there were other challenges as well, he says. We humans tend to be credulous of everything to save our credulity, something I forgot while writing the first draft of The Warrior Prophet. Originally, my idea was to slowly externalize Kalhus, that's the term that he's using, meaning to move away from his point of view and show more and more his manipulation from the outside. I'd have a wicked gleam in my eye as I wrote, thinking, what a sneaky bastard. But my readers kept coming back to me with things like, I'm so relieved Kalhus is coming around. It turned out that Kalhus was duping them as thoroughly as he was duping the characters. They knew he wasn't trustworthy, just as we know commercials aren't trustworthy, and yet the instinct was to think, it's okay, it's just so strong. And so he says, that was perhaps my second greatest difficulty I had writing Kalhus, depicting him in such a way that my readers would always have a sense of the distance between his claims and his intentions. I'm still not happy with the way I resolved this problem. So Kalhus himself is a seductive character that has to be invested with this capacity to seduce the reader as well as the characters. You know, it reminds me in a certain respect, although this is not a perfect analogy, to how when Philip K. Dick uses the oracle, meaning the I Ching, as not just something within the Man in the High Castle, but to help him write the Man in the High Castle. And later in an interview says, the oracle, you got to watch it, it's sneaky, it's deceptive, you can't trust it. You know, I came to realize this in writing that. Kalhus is similarly something like that. Again, in another interview in SFF World, he says, the strange thing is that to write is to be Kalhus, in a sense. In the same way, Kalhus can think a dozen thoughts and assess numerous possibilities where others can only think one. I get to spend hours, even days, cooking up stuff for a Kalhus section that only takes several minutes to read. I just keep thinking and thinking, and sooner or later I get lucky and come up with something smart or badass sounding to give Kalhus. He's the 1% smart me 100% of the time, which is why I don't trust him for a second. This is the author talking about his own character, who is, so central to not just the series, but particularly this book. Finally, in a great interview with Victoria Strauss, we also, get some discussion about the Holy War itself, and essentially about the series and this book. He says, in narrative terms, I wanted the Holy War to become a character, to be something that suffers, survives crises, and develops as a result. In this sense, I look at those omniscient sections, a kind of collective third-person centered point of view. I also wanted the Holy War to be entirely believable, a collective version of the psychological realism I try to bring to my characters, both for consistency's sake and because I think believability is a necessary precondition of conjuring awe or the tickle of it anyway. There's a lot going on in that passage. So let's just reiterate some of these points. The Holy War in this book becomes a character that encompasses other characters as well. He thinks that it's important to use psychological realism both for consistency's sake and so that the fantasy that he's writing can do the job that he thinks fantasy is supposed to do. A little bit later in that, he says, another thematic motive for the historical voice has to do with the question that animates the darkness that comes before in The Warrior Prophet from start to finish. What does it mean to belong to something larger than oneself? The statement, there's more than me, has got to be a signature human insight. The more calls upon us in innumerable ways, draws us out of the narrow circle of our self-interest, and makes us human, or so we like to think. Now that's a great observation. I belong to something bigger than myself. Great, but what if the bigger than yourself chews you up and spits you out? Or what if it's going to bring about an apocalypse? Or what if it's just about other people's self-interest? Or what if, and we can go on and on and on. What if it requires you to do horrible atrocities to other people to show your devotion? Not always necessarily good. So he goes on and he says, what is this more? Is it a lover, a movement, a faith, history, or people? Is it a god? What happens to our relationships when we embrace any one or combination of these? And what happens when this more becomes a weapon? Only the epic allows you to fully explore these questions, I think. I want to say only epic fantasy, but that sounds too flattering to be trusted. So that's one of the key central themes that is being explored here, while Calhus is subverting the Holy War from within to his own purposes and creating a new kind of nation, a new kind of belonging, a new kind of human unity that appears to be like all love, fate, destiny, but is really cold calculation, machination, seduction, subversion. A little bit later he says, and this is the last part of this interview that I want to bring up, lastly, I wanted to explore the collective dimension of belief and desire. All our actions are underwritten by our beliefs and our desires. We do action A rather than action B because we believe action A will give us what we want. What about extreme actions, or better yet, extreme collective actions? What kinds of beliefs and desires underwrote, for example, the lunatic extremes, the unthinkable atrocities committed, the impossible obstacles overcome of the First Crusade? One of the reasons I cleave so closely to the actual history of the First Crusade was I didn't think people would be able to believe the events I attribute to the Holy War otherwise. And all this, I think, comes back to transcendence, to the belief in more, which for some reason seems to breed both the best and the worst in humanity. So, what we've really got here is an epic fantasy of, capital E, epic scope, in terms not just of, great characters, wonderful storytelling, cool world building, but philosophical depth particularly in terms of epistemology and in terms of moral philosophy, where the metaphysics, which includes magic, is kind of serving that along the way. So this has been a long disquisition or digression. Let's talk now about what more world building happens in this story. As some of the reviewers who we just talked about earlier noted, there's less world building going on within The Warrior Prophet compared to the earlier volume, The Darkness That Comes Before. And it makes good sense, in part because they've already staged a lot of the places and their connections with each other. There is a considerable amount of, you could call it, continuing world revelation rather than world building going on in the discussions of the cities and the deserts and the locations and the interrelations between different places as the Holy War progresses southward. And actually we also learn, a little bit here and there about some of the nations of the three seas that form part of the Holy War. As a matter of fact, we get to learn a good bit more about some than others, and a lot of this comes through exposition in terms of the characters talking with each other and revealing things to each other. And you can say that nearly all of the action, with the exception of a few, let's call them vignettes that are happening elsewhere, almost all of it is taking place as the Holy War is moving south. So it's happening in the wake of that. And if you've got the book, I think you want to look at that last map, the Western Three Seas, that shows you, the progression, and that can be quite helpful. I will say this, that there is one little vignette towards the very end that takes place in the high north, or what's left of it, with these people who are taken by, they call themselves the Werigda, and they're searching for their stolen wives and children who have been taken by the Srank and by the consult, essentially, who are using them to try to find out where the sort of now revealed enemy to them are. And actually, we have a final thing. There's one key question that is being asked: who are the Dunyain, right? Who are these people that are living within the shadow of Holy Golgotharoth, to quote one of the old names that we're going to talk about before. But other than that, and some things happening at the periphery of the Holy War, and where Acamian is taken by the Scarlet Spires and then has to get his way back, along with Xenimus, who tries to rescue him and who is tortured and blinded. It's all happening in the wake of this. So I think that, we can talk about some of the key features. One that I found particularly interesting is the battle plane, where they're going to fight again, the Inrithi forces fighting against the Chianese and their various tributaries. And this is a site of an ancient battle where the no-god himself, or itself, whatever the no-god happens to be, was finally killed after the High North was basically devastated and destroyed and exploited by the consult. And the battle plane is described in some really bizarre ways. Everybody has bad dreams. The dreams for Acamian are even worse than usual and more vivid than usual. The dead, as they say, they don't escape the battle plane, rather. And there's bones and skulls and all sorts of stuff that comes up through the very ground. So that's kind of an interesting feature. And everything else is presented in a fairly linear way, but that's a key place for, you could say, producing a kind of conviction that is going to lead to a greater understanding of who it is that they genuinely are facing off against. We learn a little bit more about the High North, largely through revelations by characters. We're going to talk about some of that in a bit, but also through the continuing sequence of Acamian's dreams. The Holy War itself, there's some very interesting discussions about what's going on, and so we're going to shift a little bit from world building into talking about the progression of this, as we called it, character of the Holy War, or it's not really a character, it's more like a force, a river, a current that's going along. And, we can say that there's at first this sort of assemblage of the great names, and that continues on throughout all of it, this council of the great names, which includes, the nobility, some of whom are just puppets, like the, High Iain king, who's really just a puppet for the Scarlet Spires. We have the representative of the Nonsur Empire and Confus. We have representation of the Inrithi religion with the Shirel Knights and the Shirel representative. And then we have all of these nobility, some of whom are kind of, like Sauban. They're nobles, but they're yet to find their own place. And so we've got all of that going on. And then we have these two main people who are rivaling each other over who is going to effectively guide the military force. And one of them is Confas, right, who had been up for being the commander. And then the other is Canair. And Canair has been chosen to be the war leader. And there's some very interesting things that Canair says at a few places that I want to point out about this. So in one point, he's talking about reading the battle plane itself. Here we go. He's talking with Proyas, and so Canair says, "Are you assured of your victory?" And Proyas says, "Assured, but of course." And then he's talking with him, and Proyas says, "Because God has willed it." And Canair says, "What about Skouras? Couldn't he give the same answer, as the praying to the solitary God?" And then a little bit later on, he says, this is Canair, he says, "The memorialist recited verses dedicated to each of the Nansur columns, stories that describe their devices, their arms, and their mettle in battle, so that when the tribes went on pilgrimage or to war, they could read the Nansur battle line. This is why the people lost at Keoth. Confus switched his columns' devices, told us a false story." And Proyas says, "Any fool knows how to read his opponent's line." Canair says, "Then tell me, what story do you read on the battle plane?" And Proyas says, how am I supposed to know? I recognized only a handful. Canayer says, I recognized all of them. Of the great Chianine houses, and there are many, only 2/3 rode against us on the plains of Mengeda. Of these, several will likely token contingents, depending on how many enemies Scaurus entertains among his peers. After the massacre of the vulgar Holy War, many among the heathen, including the Pajira, were no doubt contemptuous of the Holy War's threat. And so being able to know who is from where, which is sort of like world building within the world, right? That's very important for being able to strategize in war itself. A bit later, there's this talk about teaching, right? And Proyas is talking to the great names, and he says, at Mengeda, you learn the Chianine were faster. This means no matter where you assemble, Scaurus will assemble first. But at Mengeda, you also learn the strength of your footmen, and more importantly, you taught, right? And so, that's quite an interesting idea as well. There's this discussion where Confus actually backs up Canoyer. And then there's this long discussion a little bit later, not that much later in the book, where Canayer is talking about war as a way of convincing one's foe. So he says that, Canayer says, this is how you convince your foe. And Calhus says, convince. And Canayer says, this war is simply your war made honest. Calhus says, belief. You're saying battle is a disputation of belief, an argument. And so Canayer goes on, he says, the memorialists. Now, the second reference to the memorialists, right? Who are these? These are the people among the Skilvendi who keep their knowledge alive and then teach them. They call battle a great quarrel. Both hosts take the field believing they are the victors. One host must be disabused of that belief, attacking his flank or his rear, overawing him, bewildering him, shocking him, killing him. These are all arguments meant to convince your foe he's defeated. He who believes he's defeated is defeated. And so Calhus says, so in battle conviction makes true. And the Skilvendi says, as I said, it is honest. And a little bit later on, he says, again, about the memorialists. When the memorialists counsel the chieftains before battle, they bid them to recall that in conflict all men are bound to one another, some by chains, some by ropes, some by strings, all of different lengths. They call these bindings the maya tefuri, the ligaments of war. These are all just ways of describing the strength and flexibility of a formation's angotoma. These Chianine, the people would call men of the long chain. They can be thrown apart, but they will pull themselves together. The Galioth and Tidoni we would call men of the short chain. Left alone, such men would battle and battle. Only disaster or attrition can break the chains of such men. And then he goes on and he says, the leader must continually appraise and reappraise the string, rope, and chain of his enemy and the men. And this is a very interesting point now, isn't it? Again, having to do a bit with world building, we're getting to see something about the characteristics of people, and this is typical Bakker, right? Through the eyes and the discourse of one of the particular peoples, the Skilvendi, who are the ones who can tell you the most in some respects about war, except for, of course, Confus, right, who can also do so. And so I'm going to close on this just by saying this provides us with an instance and an example of how Bakker is continuing his world building in this particular novel. One of the key thematics that R. Scott Bakker is employing and is actually making very central to the entire Prince of Nothing trilogy, a little bit less so perhaps in the books that follow, is what we could summarize as in two ways. One is not knowing who the true enemy is and therefore planning and acting against and responding against enemies that are not genuine enemies but could actually be your allies in other better circumstances. And not understanding that there are plots within plots within plots. And what I'm going to add to this that I think is really central to Bakker's own thoughts and preconceptions and preoccupations. This comes out in a lot of his other like interviews and essays, is that people are often, you might say, constrained, driven, channeled by the assumptions of their particular group, along with its history, its traditions, its ways of looking at things. Interpretation is very important. And so misinterpretation happens when you can't recognize some new information coming in that should have you say, wait a second, things are not mapping onto each other properly, and instead you kind of, force it into the hermeneutic context that you already have, and you make it fit. And this is where people make major mistakes, and not just people, but peoples, and in this case, factions as well. And so, who is the ultimate enemy in this entire thing? Well, it's the unholy consult that has been engaging in this attempt to essentially reduce the number of souls within this world down to a certain level. The consult is a bringing together of some human beings who are sort of at first the junior partners, but eventually become a major part of it. The Inkiroi, these creatures that crash landed on this world and encountered the non-men who themselves can become erratics after the womb plague, which we'll talk about some other time. And they join together in an attempt to use the technology that they have to essentially dominate the entire world, bring about the no God, cause the death and suffering and rape and exploitation of so many beings. And so that's, sort of the ultimate enemy. And what's going on with everybody else? Well, Akamian and the Mandate, they know, or they think, they suspect that the consult might still be out there, but Akamian has even got his doubts for a while until he sees the skin spy in the previous book. And the Mandate themselves, some of them believe, some of them don't. They are now sort of galvanized into action. When it comes to the others, we can talk about the other schools of sorcery. And so the main ones that would be important for this would be the Scarlet Spires. We see a lot of their back and forths about this. And then the Cisarum, who are associated with Cian, right? And the Cianese religion, the Phonemry, right? And so both of them are actually misrecognizing each other as being the enemy that is coming from the consult. The Scarlet Spires also think that the Mandate, they're a bunch of old fools. They just happen to have this really great gnosis. It would be great if we could get it from them. There are also these other schools of sorcery, but they don't play that big of a role within this particular branch of the story. And then we also have, the enemy relationship between the Cianese and the Phonim, and the other main opposed religion of Inrithism, which is being, practiced and at least given fealty by many around the three seas. And, this holy war is declared by Mythonet. In the previous book, it starts out with some, well, is it going to be a war against the sorcerers because they hate them? Or is it going to be a war against the Phonim? We don't know. And then it does get declared by the Shira. So the real, story that's going on here is there's a holy war that's happening. And the Holy War is being used to further a lot of people's beliefs, choices, values, right? The Emperor wants to use it to retake parts of the Nanser Empire and become an aspect Emperor once again. It's not going to happen. Some of the other people like Salban want to get some territory for themselves. The Scarlet Spires view this as an opportunity for revenge. It gets subverted from within by Calhus, who's going to use this holy war for his own purposes. And so, a lot of people are at war with each other, fighting each other, spilling blood, without really understanding who these things should be directed against. And so, the discovery that the skin spies have infiltrated practically all of the great factions, this is a major deal, major significance. And, Calhus is really one of the main characters, and we find out that at a certain point, Calhus realizes that everything has changed for him. Here we go. He says, everything had transformed since he had taken Drusus Akamian as his teacher. The ground of this world he now knew had concealed many, many secrets from his brethren, and these are the Dunyain. The Logos remained true, but its ways were far more devious and far more spectacular than the Dunyain had ever conceived. And the Absolute, the end of ends, was more distant than they'd ever imagined. So many obstacles, so many forks in the path. So even these people who seem to know everything, they're deluded as well about the nature of things. It goes on and says, despite his initial skepticism, Calhus had come to believe much of what Akamian had claimed over the course of their discussions. He believed the stories of the first apocalypse. He believed the faceless thing before him was an artifact of the consult. But the Calamonian prophecy, the coming of the second apocalypse, such things were absurd. By definition, the future couldn't anticipate the present. What came after couldn't come before. Could it? And then he goes on and he says, there was so much that must await his father, so many questions, right? And Calhus is going to figure out that, not only is there sorcery, not only is there all of this other stuff going on, the consult existing, maybe there is prophecy as well. Maybe the past and the future are related in ways different than the Dunyain understood it through their, essentially, philosophy of nature and psychology. And so, this is quite an interesting issue. He goes on and he says, 1,000 possibilities galloping across the trackless steppe of what was to come, 100 scenarios flashing through his soul, some branching and branching, terminally deflected from his objectives, others flaring out in disaster. And he's trying to use the probability trance to understand what he ought to do. A little bit earlier in the book, very early on actually, in chapter 2, there we go. Akamian is talking to Calhus and tells him about the prophecy. And Calhus says, after Akamian says, you're the sign, he says, that doesn't make sense, Akka. The fact that I'm here means nothing. Nothing. Now I'm here, and before I was in Atithrao, there we go. And if my bloodline reaches back as far as you say, then Anna Surambur has always been here, whatever that may be. And then there's a revelation. Akka says, I found them. I found the consult. The night you and the others celebrated Proyas' victory over the emperor, I was summoned to the Andamene Heights by no less than Ikure Konfas and brought to the imperial catacombs. And he goes on and he tells him about this. And he says, listen, he actually called me Chigra, which is Sethwatha's name in the perverted speech of the Srank. Somehow he could see Sethwatha's trace within me. For another, he had no face. He was an abomination of the flesh, a spy that can mimic the form of any man without sorcery or sorcery's mark, perfect spies. And he goes on and he said, well, what does that mean? It means the consult has mastered the old science. Srank, Bashrags, dragons, all the abominations of the Inkaroi are artifacts of the Techne, the old science created long ago when the non-men still ruled Iarwa. It was thought destroyed when the Inkaroi were annihilated before the Tusk was even written, but these skin spies are new artifacts of the old science. And if the consult has rediscovered the old science, there's a chance they know how to resurrect Mag Farao, the no-god. And so, this places everything into context, a context that we, the readers, can understand, and a context that some of the characters themselves can understand. By the very end of the work, after Calhus has been denounced as a false prophet, and Akamian goes to Proyas and the other great names, and Canair, fights Sarkellus, and all of these things are sort of revealed. We now get to the point where we can have everybody else in on the great secret. And so this happens towards the very end of the book. Akamian tells us a bit of a story. I'm not going to trace all of this out, but he's talking to Proyas, and he says, thousands of years before men had crossed the great Carissus, before even the Chronicle of the Tusk was written, the non-men ruled these lands. And like us, they warred amongst themselves for honor, riches, yes, even for faith. But the greatest of their wars they fought not against themselves, nor even against our ancestors. The greatest of their wars they fought against the Incaroi, a race of monstrosities, a race who exulted in the subtleties of the flesh, forging perversities from life the way we forge swords from iron. Srank, Basrag, even Raku, dragons are relics of their ancient wars. Led by the great Kujara, Kinmoy, these non-men kings battled them across the plains through the high and deep places of the earth. After ordeal and grievous sacrifice, they beat the Incaroi back to their first and final stronghold, a place the non-men called Min Oroikus, the pit of obscenities. I'll not recount the horrors of that place. Suffice it to say the Incaroi were overthrown, extinguished, or so it was thought. And the non-men cast a glamour around it so it would remain forever hidden. And then they retired to the remnants of their ruined world, a triumphant yet broken race. Centuries later, the men of Iana descended the Cairsus, howling multitudes of them, led by their chieftain kings, our fathers of yore. You know their names, for they're enumerated in the chronicles of the Tusk. They swept the dwindling non-men before them, sealing up their great mansions, driving them into the sea. For an age, knowledge of the Incaroi and men Eroicus passed from all souls. Only the non-men remembered, and they dared not leave their mountain fastness. But as the years passed, the enmity between our races waned. Treaties were forged between the remaining non-men and the Norserai of Tirsa and Sauglich. Knowledge and goods were exchanged, and men learned for the first time of the Incaroi and their wars against the non-men. Then, under the heirs of Ninkaru Telesser, a non-man sorcerer named Katingra, who you know as Metikrig from the sagas, revealed the location of Minoroicus to Sheorana, the grand vizier of the ancient Gnostic school of Mangeka. The glamour about the stronghold was broken, and the schoolmen of that school reclaimed it to the woe of us all. So he goes on and he says that eventually they became enamored of their inhuman ways, and they fell upon their obscene and degenerate craft, the techne with the curiosity of monkeys. Most importantly, they discovered the no God. And so he goes on and he says, this is what you know from the plains of all that. Now, here's the key thing in coming back to this theme. This is why I come to you now. Heed me, for I know of what I speak. These creatures, these skin spies that infiltrate your ranks, have no relation to the Cicerum. By calling them such, you simply do what all men do when assailed by the unknown. You drag it into the circle of what you know. You clothe new enemies in the trappings of old. But these things hail from far outside your circle, from time out of memory. Think of what we saw moments ago. These skin spies are beyond your craft or ken, beyond even that of the Cicerum who you fear and hate. They are agents of the consult, and their mere existence omens disaster. Only deep mastery of the techne could bring such obscenities to life. A mastery that promises the resurrection of the no-God is nigh. We mandate schoolmen, as you know, dream of the ancient world's end, and in all those dreams there's one we suffer more than any other, the death of Kelumas, the high king of Kunari, on the fields of Eliot, Anasurambor Kelumas, right? And he then says, listen, this guy here in front of you, he is the prophet, but he's also the result of this prophecy. And so if you want to save the world, save humanity, you'd better figure out how to fix things. And there's one other passage I want to bring up where we actually get to see a good bit about these consults. right? It's when the Synthess, which is one of the old names, and the old names are the people from the original consult, is talking with the skin spies, right? And is engaging in some discussion about who is who and what's going on. And here we go. What have you learned? And this is the skin spy. He's not Cisarum. Indeed, the Synthess said. Then what is he? Dunyain. And then the Synthess says, all games end with me, Gaortha, all games. Sarkellus became very still. I play no game. This man is Dunyain. That's what the Skilvendi calls him. She said, there's no doubt. And then the old name says, but there's no order called Dunyain in Atrithau. No, but then we know he's not a prince of there either. The old name paused, as though to cycle large human thoughts through a small bird intellect. Perhaps it's no coincidence this order takes its name from ancient Cuneric. Perhaps this man's name is not a clumsy Cicerum lie after all. Perhaps he is of the old seed. Could the non-men have trained him? Perhaps, but we have spies even in Ishturabinth. There's little that Nin Kilgerus does that we don't know, very little. No, it continued, this Dunyain is not a ward of the non-men. When the light of ancient Cuneri was stamped out, many stubborn embers survived. The mandate is such an ember. Perhaps the Dunyain is another just as stubborn. The blue eyes flickered, but perhaps far more secretive. And so what we have here is the realization of, on the part of the consult, the secret enemy, of who their new enemy is. The Dunyain and Kelhus. Now notice that the consult are using the Holy War to try to destroy the Cicerum, because it seems to them that the Cicerum are the only ones who can actually resist them. So lots of different things going on in this. Lots of wheels within wheels within wheels. One important theme that we mentioned in the reviews of R. Scott Bakker's work as a whole, and also fitting into the Warrior Prophet, is the status of women. And I think that I would like to focus primarily on one main character, because I think that you can make the charge that Cherryh, she is developed as a character, but she's not going to go beyond essentially being the worshipper of Kelhus and part of this community that's developing around it. There's the relation between her and Knair and Kelhus that's going on, and there's the Empress as well. Although I don't actually find her that interesting of a character myself, nor do I actually find the Emperor particularly interesting. But Asimov is really an absolutely central character throughout the entire Prince of Nothing series, going well into the other 4 volumes of the Second Apocalypse. And she's already been developed as quite a robust and interesting character already. And I think you can say that one of the threads that is running throughout the Warrior Prophet, as well as back into the darkness that came before, and is going to run into the Thousandfold Thought, is this love story between her and Akamian, where they're living this life where he's a mandate sorcerer, she is a prostitute. They can't really be together, but they are together. And you could say that their work life is precluding them from having the fullness of a marriage. And then they're apart from each other, and there's this whole background of the consult that's going on as well. And then they find each other in the course of the Holy War. They're enjoying being together and actually breaking some of the conventions and the commitments that they've made to others to enjoy a full marriage. And then catastrophe hits, right? Then she thinks that he's dead. She winds up becoming drawn in by Kelhus, and there's a lot of development that's taking place on her part in this, becoming a fuller person, becoming greater, becoming something something new, but then eventually she also is getting seduced by Kelhus as well, and then Acamian comes back victoriously from his, let's call it, not even contest, but small war with the Scarlet Spires. And so Asimov is a very interesting and, like I said, well-developed character in this, and I like the idea that Bakker expressed that he's not going to try to shoehorn characters, through representation into things. And there are some really important discussions that happen in this work. So one of them is when she and Acamian come back together, and she says, you pretended I wasn't there when they encountered each other in the previous book. What was she talking about? Acamian pressed palms to his forehead, wrestled with the urge to lash out, to punish. She stood close enough to touch after all this time, and yet she receded. He needed to understand. Esme, what are you? And she says, what was it, Aka? Was I too polluted, too defiled, too much a filthy whore? No, Esme, I, too bruised a peach. Esemet, listen. And she said, so you're going to take me to your tent, you say, add me to the bushel? And he says, you speak of bushels to me. And then he repents. And then he says, I can explain everything, Esme. And he says, the night you're talking about, if I didn't see you, it wasn't because I was ashamed of you. How could I be? How could anyone, let alone a sorcerer, be ashamed of a woman such as you? She bit her lip, smiled through more tears than why. Acamian rolled to his side and laid next to her, his eyes searching the dark canvas above. Because I found them, Esme, that very night. I found the consult, right? And, they talk together about all of this. And they have these conferences, and it's very important that these are where they can be like in full confidence with each other. And one of the things I do want to say that I think really comes through when it comes to the character of Asimov, we've already seen her characterized and developed as somebody who learns, somebody who pays attention to things, somebody who wants to know about the world, somebody who is exercising the intellect. And she's within a world where women, because of patriarchy and misogyny and all these assumptions that are going on, are being treated as automatically inferior beings. And they live quite often a precarious existence. And there's a lot of interesting points in here where the difference between men and women is coming up. Here's an example where Bakker is actually harnessing some Jean-Paul Sartre. Here we go. According to Acamian, women had no instinct for principle. For them, everything was embodied. How would he put it? Oh, yes, that existence preceded essence for women. By nature, the tracks traveled by their souls ran parallel to those demanded by principle. The feminine soul was more yielding, more compassionate, more nurturing than the masculine. Consequently, principle became more difficult for them to see, like a staff in a thicket, which is why women were more likely to confuse selfishness for propriety, which apparently was what she was doing. And this is Asimov thinking about this, thinking this over. So what we see here is a dialectical transformation of what she's getting from men, and then she's thinking through these things and making it her own. This is going to sound rather facetious, but Asimov is sort of like a Simone de Beauvoir or a Hannah Arendt in her own time, working within a world that's been largely given to them by men, and thinking about things through the realms of their own experience, and then, making something new of it through this thinking. A little bit later in, actually a good bit later in the work, here we go. Asimov talks about there being a void in her learning. And here we go. Asimov had tried many times since her daughter's death to attend to the void within her. She tried questioning away by asking the priest she bedded, but they always said the same thing. that the god dwelt only in temples and that she'd made a brothel of her body, then they would brothel her again. For a time she tried smearing it away by coupling with men for anything, half copper's bread, even a rotted onion, but men could never fill, only muddy. So she turned to others like her watching, observing. She studied the always laughing whores who somehow exulted in being guttered day for night, or the chirping slave girls, their faces anchored forward beneath their water urns, smiling and rolling their eyes from side to side. She made their motions her motions, as though certainty were a kind of dance, and for a time she discovered comfort, as though habits of gesture and expression could drum for a deadened heart. For a time she forgot the distance between a fact and a face. She had never tried to love. If joy in gesture couldn't unseat desolation, then perhaps joy in desperation, right? And she is in love with Acamian. But, this is, again, something where she is in the process of ripening a becoming more that has been going on throughout her life. She is a philosophical character in a way that, dwarfs that of Proyas, maybe even Canaire. I would say Calhus, Acamian, that sort of trilogy of those three, they're all, Calhus is of course placed on a higher level in certain respects, but the development that's going on, the realizations, she's actually sort of coming from behind, from being a woman, being illiterate, having to learn everything on the sly, but in some respects she's got a broader base to draw upon. There's a discussion that I wanted to bring up as well about women's places and roles. And here we go. Yes, here she's talking about waiting for Acamian when he's gone missing because the Scarlet Spires have taken. And she says, helplessness. If women were hope's oldest companions, it was due to helplessness. Certainly women often exercise dreadful power over a single hearth, but the world between hearths belonged to men, and it was into this that Acamian had disappeared, cold darkness between fire pits. All she could do was wait. What greater anguish could there be than waiting? Nothing etched the shape of one's impotence with more galling meticulous than the blank passage of time. Moment after moment, some dull with disbelief, others taut with voiceless shrieks, moment after gnashing moment. And she goes on a little bit more. Waiting. This is what tradition said a woman should do, to wait at the hearth's edge, to peer and yet always be stared down, to haggle endlessly with nothing, to think without hope of insight, to repeat words said and words implied, to chase hints into incantations as though by their tumbling precision and the sheer pitch of their pain, the movements of her souls might seize the world at some deeper level and force it to yield. Right? And so, again, she is making her own, as we say, silent inquiries without an interrogation, without hope of answer. Very important what she's going through there, and very important how it's being depicted. We're seeing it from within her own eyes, and there's musing going on. I want to say a few other things about her character, and we could actually spend an entire session just unpacking these. When she does become involved with Calhus, it's not as if she isn't already learning before that, but she is able to sort of, you might say, progress in higher lessons. Calhus is ultimately going to teach her to read and help her reinterpret, the religious texts that ground her identity in ways that she doesn't want to, as somebody who's essentially condemned by the Tusk and by the other religious writings. So she's going to have this already formidable intellect that she's got going on, connected with life, a very practical, but still also, metaphysical in the sense of going into human nature and thinking about society's way of looking at things, and it's going to be unfolded and unpacked and unfolded. Part of that is happening through her relation with Acamian, but it's going to happen even more with Calhus in Acamian's absence. And I think you can say that that's part of what produces the the tension between them. So that's very important as well. I want to bring up one other passage where she ends up renouncing Akamian, because I think it's quite important. And this is where we also get to see Kalhus at work. Kalhus turned once more to Esimet, peeled away her face with the hooks of his gaze. She'd already made 2 trips from the fire to her tent, promenades to draw his attention and covertly gauge his interest. She periodically looked from side to side, feigning amusement and things elsewhere to see if he watched her. Twice he let her catch him. Each time he grinned with boyish good nature. Each time she looked down, blushing, pupils dilated, eyes blinking rapidly, her body radiating the musk of nascent arousal. Though Esimet had not yet come to his bed, part of her ached for him, even wooed him, and she knew it not. For all her native gifts, and this is important, she has native gifts and she has developed them, she remained a world-born woman as opposed to being a Dunyain, right? And for all world-born men and women, 2 souls shared the same body, face, and eyes, the animal and the intellect. Everyone was 2, defective. One Esimet had already renounced Drusus Akamian, the other would soon follow. And that renunciation is going to lead her into her greater involvement with Kalhus, ultimately becoming his consort in later development of the story. So there's a lot going on here with this character. Again, we could explore this in much greater detail, but let's move on now to talking about this big character, Kalhus. It's clear to me that this video is going to go beyond the 90-minute mark. I'm going to try to keep things relatively short, and there probably are a lot of philosophical themes that we're not going to be able to get to, and even involving characters. But the one that we absolutely cannot avoid, I think, is what's going on with Kalhus, right? So who is the warrior prophet? Kalhus, right? Who is the Prince of Nothing? Kalhus. And as we've seen in Bakker's own discussion of this, there's a certain difficulty in writing this ultimately seductive and self-moving character. So there's a couple themes that I think we can bring up in relation to Kalhus. One of them is this idea about being self-moved movers or not being such, right? The thoughts and desires that produce our actions, produce our attitudes, produce our words, coming from a darkness that goes before, and the goal of actually becoming a self-moved mover. Now, that's something that the Dunyain are centered upon and trying to teach, and that Kalhus brings into the story. He also notes that most people do think of themselves as self-moved movers when perhaps they don't really have a full right to call themselves such. And there's a couple things to bring up with this. One is that as the warrior prophet, as this develops throughout the work, right, and it goes in stages, he is in effect taking over the movement of the Holy War, both as a whole and in its important moving parts like, Salban, Proyas, even his opposition to Confus. Knayer is another important person involved in this as well. And so he is taking advantage of the fact that the Dunyain, through their understanding of philosophy and human nature, are able to manipulate others, are able to understand what motivates them. And everybody else is essentially subject to being moved, right? So there's some really interesting discussions here, and I just want to bring up 2 of them. One happens in the course of these many addresses that he is giving as people are gathering around him as the warrior prophet. So this gives you an idea of what's happening. So I'm going to read a little bit before this. The numbers attending began to swell, not so fast that Akamian could notice a difference between consecutive nights, but fast enough that several dozen had become hundreds by the time the Holy War neared Shigek. A handful of more devoted listeners would assemble a small wooden platform upon which they would lay a mat between two iron braziers. Calhoun would sit cross-legged, poised and immobile between the shining flames. Usually he would wear a plain yellow cassock, looted from the Sapitashah's camp on the plains of Mengeta, and somehow, whether by posture, bearing, or some trick of the light, he would look unearthly, even glorious. So he's talking about what's happening one particular night. And as always, Calhoun searched the faces of those before him, his eyes glinting with compassion. After a few heartbeats, his gaze settled upon one man, a Corinthian knight, by the look of his tunic and the heft of his gold rings. Otherwise, he looked haggard, as though he still slept on the battle plain. Calhoun says, "What happened?" And the nameless knight says, we went to this village hoping for plunder. And what did Calhoun says, "What did you find?" "A child, a dead child. We were following this trail, something worn by goat herds, I think, cutting across this hillside, and there was just this dead child, a girl, no more than 5 or 6, lying in our path. Her throat had been cut." "What happened next?" "Nothing. We simply ignored her, continued riding as though she were nothing more than discarded cloth, a scrap of leather in the dust." He added, his voice breaking. He looked down to his calloused palms. "Guilt and shame rack you by day," Calhoun said, "that feeling that you've committed some mortal crime. Nightmares rack you by night. She speaks to you." The man's nod was almost comical in its desperation. He hadn't, Acamian realized, the nerve for war. "But why?" he cried. "How many dead have we seen?" And then Calhoun says, "But not all seeing is witness." The man says, "I don't understand." And Calhoun says, "Witness is the seeing that testifies, that judges so that it may be judged. You saw and you judged. A trespass had been committed. An innocent had been murdered. You saw this." "Yes," the man hissed, "a little girl. And now you suffer." "But why?" he cried. "Why should I suffer? She's not mine. She was heathen." Calhoun says, "Everywhere we're surrounded by the blessed and the cursed, the sacred and the profane, but our hearts are like hands. They grow callous to the world, and yet our hands like our hands, even the most callous heart will blister if overworked or chafed by something new. For some time we may feel the pinch, but we ignore it because we have so much work to do." Calhoun looked down into his right hand. Suddenly he balled it into a fist, raised it high. Then with one strike, with a hammer or a sword, and the blister breaks, and our heart is torn. And then we suffer, for we feel the ache for the blessed, the sting of the curse. We no longer see, we witness. And then the man says, "What should I do?" And Calhoun says, "Rejoice." "Rejoice? But I suffer." "Yes, rejoiced. The calloused hand cannot feel the lover's cheek. When we witness, we testify. And when we testify, we make ourselves responsible for what we see. And that is what it means to belong." Somebody says, "Should we celebrate suffering?" And Prince Calhoun says, "Then it's no longer suffering, is it?" No, that's not what I mean. Celebrate the meaning of suffering. Rejoice that you belong, not that you suffer. Remember what the latter prophet teaches us. Glory comes in joy and sorrow. Joy and sorrow. And then the man says, I see the wisdom of your words. I truly see, but," and then Calhoun says, "I'm not asking you to see. I'm asking you to witness, to be one with the world in which you dwell, to make a covenant of your life." And so this is a great example of the sort of teaching that Calhoun is using, and there's something very true to it, and yet we know at the same time that all of this is being done to snare people in. And at some points, the guard comes down, and Knier, for example, is able to reveal this about Calhoun and about the Dunyan. I'm going to read a passage regarding that. That'll be a nice apposite to what we just looked at. And so, here it is. Knier says that he's realized what the Dunyan really are, right? And he finds that in a certain way his life has lost its sense and its meaning, right? Because of that. Actually, let me skip ahead to another passage. The passage I was thinking about right there is where Knier actually asks Calhoun to kill him. Here we go. At a certain point, I was looking at the wrong thing. He says he knows the secret of the Dunyain, right? The Dunyain make disciples of all men, whether they revere him or not. One need only breathe. Even my hate, Knier thought, even my hate he uses to his advantage. Though his heart rankled at this, it rankled far more at the thought of losing Mengus. Calhus had spoken true those long months past in the Utimat camp. His heart had only one quarry, and it could not be fed on surrogates. He was bound to the Dunyain as the Dunyain was bound to Serway's corpse. Any shame, any indignity, he would bear any injury, commit any atrocity to whet his vengeance. He would see the whole world burn before he would surrender his hate. That was the obsessive heart of his strength, not his blade, not his frame, his neck-breaking, wife-striking, shield-cracking hate. Hatred had secured him the white yash. Hatred had bonded his body with holy scars. Hatred had preserved him from the Dunyain when they crossed the steep. Hatred and hatred alone had kept him sane. Of course, the Dunyain had known this. After Mengus, Knier had fled to the codes of the people, thinking they could preserve his heart. And, he goes on and he has a sort of revelation into things. There were no codes. There was no honor. The world between men was as trackless as the steppe, as the desert. There were no men. Only beasts, clawing, craving, mewling, braying, gnawing at the world with their hungers, beaten like bears into dancing to this absurd custom or that. All these thousands, these men of the tusk, killed and died in the name of delusion. Save hunger, nothing commanded the world. That was the secret of the Dunyain. That was their monstrosity. That was their fascination. And so, this is, in a certain sense, Knier, although Akamian will have an insight into this much later on, is the only one who can really see what's going on with Calhus and the people that he represents. There's also a really interesting discussion about fanaticism and betrayal between Akamian and Calhus earlier on in the work. And remember, Akamian in this work becomes very quickly early on Calhus's teacher, first teaching him philosophy and all this other stuff, then later on, after debating at the Gnosis, so he can become a sorcerer himself. But very quickly, it's apparent that this is not an ordinary student. He's just soaking up knowledge, and Akamian is being taught himself in the process. And not in the way that we sometimes trivialize and we say, oh, the teacher becomes the student, and I learn so much from teaching my students. More, again, like this pit opening up in front of him. So there's this discussion that goes on where Calhus begins it by saying, there's more than one kind of fanaticism. The sorcerer's eyes widened momentarily, then narrowed in anxious thoughts of Inarau and the events of the previous year. And Akamian said, but not all fanaticisms are equal. How do you mean? Not equal in principle or not equal in consequence? The truth, Akamian said, the truth distinguishes them. No matter what the fanaticism, inithry, consult, or even mandate, the consequences are the same. Men die or suffer. The question is one of what they die or suffer for. And Calhus says, so purpose, true purpose, justifies suffering, even death? You must believe as such, otherwise you wouldn't be here. Calhus smiled as though abashed at having been exposed. So it all comes to truth. If one's purposes are true, Akamian fills in, anything can be justified, any torment, any murder. Then Calhus says, any betrayal. Akamian stared, his nimble face as stony as he could manage, but Calhus saw past the dark skin, past the sheath of fine muscle, even past the soul that toiled beneath. He saw arcana and anguish, a yearning steeped in 3,000 years of wisdom. He saw a child beaten and bullied by a drunken father. He saw 100 generations of Neroni fishermen pinioned between hunger and the cruel sea. He saw Seswatha and the madness of war without hope. He saw ancient Ketyai tribesmen surge down mountain slopes. He saw the animal rooting and rutting, reaching back to time out of memory. He didn't see what came after. He saw what came before. Any betrayal, the sorcerer repeated dully. He is close. And your cause, Calhus pressed, the prevention of the second apocalypse. It is true, there can be no doubt. So in the name of that cause, you can commit any act, any betrayal. Acamian's eyes slackened in dread, and Calhoun glimpsed a worry too fleet to become a question. The schoolmen had become accustomed to the efficiency of their discourse. Rarely had they ever wandered from question to question as they did now. It's strange, Acamian said, the way things spoken with assurance by one can sound so outrageous when repeated by another. It troubles, Calhoun said, because it shows conviction is as cheap as words. Any man can believe unto death. Any man can claim your claim. So then he says, so you fear I'm no different than any other fanatic. And it's a very interesting reflection on what motivates people. The Holy War and these conflicts are motivated by a certain kind of fanaticism that Calhoun himself can take advantage of. There's also one of the other key things that's happening with Calhoun here, this consolidation of roles. You know, the warrior prophet, two different things here. He's also going to become a sorcerer. Ultimately, he's going to attain a much greater role. And why? So that he can reach his father, and so he can also, as he's now figuring out, deal with the consult. There's a lot of other things going on, but I think where I want to finish up here, I'll mention two other things that you should pay attention to in the work. There's this, there are these passages where, as we saw in the previous book, we get to see some of Calhoun's training. So there's the unmasking room and the neuropuncture that we see happening. There's the discussion about fighting, conflict, trees, movement. Those are important. But I think we should talk about one of the things that's going to, in addition to making him a prophet, bring him to the point where he can actually become something even greater, which is a sorcerer. And Acamian plays a central role in this, right? Acamian has to decide whether to teach him the gnosis. So here's a good passage. Do I teach him the gnosis? To his gut, he balked at the notion. The mere thought of surrendering the gnosis to someone outside his school made him blanch. He wasn't even sure he could teach Calhoun the gnosis, even if he desired. His knowledge of the gnosis was the one thing he shared with Seswatha, whose imprint owned every movement of his slumbering soul. Never in the history of their school had a sorcerer of rank betrayed the gnosis. Only the gnosis had allowed the mandate to survive. Only the gnosis had allowed them to carry Seswatha's war through the millennia. Lose it, and they became no more than a minor school. His brothers, Acamian knew, would fight themselves to extinction to prevent that from happening. They would hunt both of them without relenting, and they would kill them if they could. They would not listen to reasons, and the name Drusus Acamian would become a curse in the dark halls of Atrasis. But what was this other than greed or jealousy? The second apocalypse was imminent. Hadn't the time come to arm all the three seas? Hadn't Seswatha bid them share their arsenal before the shadow fell? He had. And wouldn't this make, here's where we see seductive logic or good practical reasoning, Acamian the most faithful of all mandate schoolmen? In his bones he knew Calhoun had been sent. The peril was too great and the promise too breathtaking. He'd watched as Calhoun consumed a lifetime of knowledge in the space of months. He'd listened as Calhoun voiced truths of thought more subtle than Agencus, truths of passion more profound than Sejanus. He'd sat in the dust gaping as the man extended the geometries of Muratetus beyond the limits of comprehension. He corrected the ancient logic, then drafted new logics, the way a child might scribble spirals with a stick. What would the gnosis be to such a man? A plaything? What would he discover? What power would he wield? But what if Asimov were right? Now notice, Asimov plays a role here. What if Acamian were merely the test, like old evil Shekol in the tractate, offering Indri, Sejanus, his thigh bone scepter, his army, his harem, everything save his crown to stop preaching? Prophet and sorcerer. The Tusk called such men shaman. The word lay like a ziggurat in his thoughts, immovable. Shaman. No, this is madness. For 2,000 years, mandate schoolmen had kept the gnosis safe. 2,000 years, who is he to forsake such a tradition? And so this is, a really important central turning point. Calhoun is going to become this pivotal point, but not a pivotal point in the sense of, the axis that everyone else simply revolves around. There are human relations connecting all of these people together. And what I want to close on is reminding us that Calhus himself, although he's, extremely gifted and the product of all this, genetic lineage and training and, absorbing all of these other things along the way, is in the process of learning himself. He had several big adjustment periods where he had to come to realize that, for example, sorcery is real and that, prophecy might also be real as well. So what we're going to see in this is the development of Calhus as a human, perhaps as a superhuman, but still rooted in the human, the potentialities that humanity has to offer, and yet being connected to all these people around him. And we're given a double image, we could say. This is what I'll actually close on. We have the Calhus who seems to be even more human than the human in the sense of showing affection, understanding, empathy, all these sorts of things, and also steel resolve for the good. And at the same time, as Knier has recognized, the Dunyain serve nobody, perhaps not even notions of goodness. They may be fighting against the evil of the consult, but they're not trying to bring about a utopia or completely straighten people out. Even Calhus, when he's doing good for others, he's serving his own purposes. And so there's this tension here that's not fully explored at this point. It will become more evident in the next book yet to come, as well as the books following those. So I'm just going to leave it at that.